Good evening. I'm going to begin. Apologies, we have a few little technical issues and Dr. Neal Kennedy's camera is being temperamental, so you may not be able to see his face, but if we can sort it out, he might pop in a little later. So good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Elena Strong. I'm the Executive Director at the National Museum Bermuda, and I'd like to welcome you all tonight to tonight's virtual lecture, Reckoning with the Slave Ship Enterprise by Dr. Neal Kennedy. History is far more than a collection of dates, events, and objects. It's about context and builds critical thinking skills and empathy. Learning history is central to understanding contemporary issues and helps explain how Bermuda positions itself in the world, how this was done in the past and the present, and how it can be done in the future. Reckoning with the Slave Ship Enterprise is part of our Bermuda and the Atlantic World Lecture Series, and one of many ways that the museum is providing opportunities to better understand Bermuda's past. Whether cultural, familial, social, or political, Bermuda has links with Latin and North America, the Caribbean, Africa, UK, and Europe. This lecture series intends to explore these links and the global forces that help shape Bermuda as we know it today, and how Bermuda shaped the Atlantic world. Tonight, I'm delighted to introduce you to our guest speaker, historian and archaeologist, Dr. Neal Kennedy. He's an associate professor with the Department of History at Memorial University, Canada. He specializes in 17th century Bermuda and the Caribbean. Dr. Kennedy's research encompasses all of the Atlantic islands, and with a particular interest in credit, gender, and reputation in the English Atlantic, and with illicit trade in the Caribbean. He's also engaged in projects relating to exploring remigration, unfree mariners, the Atlantic salt trade, and shipbuilding and inshore fishing in early Bermuda. He's currently writing a book called Bermuda Bound, Patrick Williams and the Margins of Atlantic Abolitionism, which examines the unfolding of emancipation and its aftermath in Bermuda. The project explores core issues of identity and race through the first historical examination of enslaved Bermudian Patrick Williams, who freed himself only to be sold into plantation slavery in Louisiana. We will certainly invite Dr. Kennedy back to discuss this book at a future lecture when the book comes out. Before I hand over to Dr. Kennedy, I would like to thank the museum's generous community of donors. This lecture series is made possible by the museum's Future of History campaign, which supports education, expansion, and institutional stability, ushering in a new era at the National Museum. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be available on our website and YouTube channel. So now over to you, Dr. Kennedy, and hopefully eventually maybe the camera will work.
Thank you, Elena. Good evening, everyone. I do apologize for this camera issue. Here I am 2,000 kilometers north of you and you can't see me. But it's my great privilege to talk to you tonight about an incident that's really well known in Bermuda, but is surprisingly little known outside of Bermuda and little studied. An incident that Governor Stephen Chapman called an occurrence of a very novel and important nature. The first incident of an American slave ship entering a British port after the Emancipation Act came into force on August 1st, 1834, arriving in a colony now with neither slavery nor apprenticeship, but where the shape of post-emancipation society remained to be worked out. So I want to talk a little bit tonight about an ongoing project myself and my colleague Sarah Hannon have been engaged in thinking about the place of the enterprise in narratives of emancipation in Bermuda, in which the ship's arrival in 1835 was seen as both a test and a fulfillment of competing perspectives on slavery and freedom in post-emancipation Bermuda. Just 10 years before, one anti-slavery society had called Bermuda's laws restricting the manumission of the enslaved as among the harshest and most opprobrious in the entire British Empire. So what explained the reception of these freedom seekers in Bermuda in 1835? And so Sarah and I have been thinking about the various meanings of reckoning, as Elena just nicely outlined as we think about history. Reckoning as to think with, reckoning as to account for, what it might mean to reckon with the slave ship enterprise in the context of emancipation. It is surprising just how little has been written about the enterprise and how little of that draws on the local documents in Bermuda, the Colonial Office correspondence, or other documents overseas. And so small discrepancies and misconstrued details have slipped into the retelling, in part, I think, because of a relative paucity of sources that are being looked at. Sarah and I do see very much that our work is in conversation with the really important foundational work on the subject by Nellie Mewson in 1975, Dr. Kenneth Robinson in 1979. Many of you here will be familiar with both of those important books. Both of those books, in thinking about the enterprise, focused on the receptivity of the Black community to those on the enterprise, and secondly, on the successful integration of those people into the Black Bermudian community. This is a narrative about the enterprise that centers resilience and self-created opportunity. In that sense, I think, is captured by the title of Chesley Trott's beautiful statue, We Arrive, not they, but we, a sense of shared community. We also see ourselves in conversation with Cyril Packwood's 1975 Chained on the Rock, which, although it doesn't mention the enterprise specifically, does engage in discussion of the limited emancipation of 1834 and the efforts of colonial elites to maintain authority in anticipation of social unrest and labor disputes, such as the increased requirements for office holding, limits on mobility, changes to bringing suits to the assize court, and so on. Nellie Mewson's account of the enterprise forms the standard basis, often the only basis, for nearly everything written outside of Bermuda about the enterprise. It is the main source for a new book, historian Jeffrey Kerr Ritchie's 2019 book, Rebellious Passage, which has really the most extensive discussion yet in an academic book about the enterprise, but even that is just a few pages. So Sarah and I started out with two questions. First, since so little was being referred to in the published work, what are the historical materials related to the enterprise? Not surprisingly, while there isn't a huge amount, there is much more than has been drawn upon before. And tonight I wanted to talk about just a few of those sources. Given that so little of the available, our second question was that given so little of the available historical material was being drawn on, what had shaped the public or common narrative told about the enterprise in Bermuda? Henry Wilkinson, for instance, in his 1975 Bermuda in the Age of Steam, doesn't refer to the enterprise at all, while James Smith, in his 1976 Slavery in Bermuda, does little more than quote the Royal Gazette story on the redemption of the passengers, and he emphasizes the decision to not institute the post-slavery apprenticeship system in Bermuda to suggest the enterprise incident shows continuity with the supposed benign slavery before 1835. The little bit of American academic work that mentions the enterprise in passing usually places it in anticipation of other better-known incidents of American slave ships in British ports, without much reference to the particular circumstances in Bermuda, and mostly done in the context of the later diplomatic dispute between Britain and the USA over compensation, which was not resolved until 1854. So I think taken as a whole, we have some narratives that collapse time, other narratives that take a celebratory tone, we have some silences, and we have more recent histories which try to balance a longer-term hopefulness with the profound difficulties Black Bermudians continue to face after emancipation. It seemed to us then that instead of focusing on the central matter of those 72 people who made an active choice for freedom in Bermuda, for the most part, these narratives tend to present the enterprise captives as accepting a freedom created by and presented to them by others. That is, for the most part, the enslaved on the enterprise are cast as passive participants in what seems primarily a legal process rather than a social and political process. Okay, then, so how might we reckon with those various accounts with what we can know about the enterprise? And so this is an ongoing project, and I'll just touch on a few elements of that tonight. So next slide, please. So let's start with the common narrative of the enterprise, just quickly, so we're all on the same page in essence. I haven't been able to find an illustration of the enterprise specifically, which isn't surprising, but here are a couple of examples just so we can visualize roughly the nature of the enterprise. On the left, we have a typical illustration of a brig, and on the upper right, a replica that's still operating now, which is slightly smaller than the enterprise was, but keep those in mind as we go on. All right, so in January of 1835, an American slave ship, a brig, a very common type of vessel in this period, named the Enterprise, sailed from Washington, D.C. to Charleston, South Carolina, carrying a mixed cargo of goods, including 78 enslaved women, men, and children. Not long after the ship left the Chesapeake Bay and entered the Atlantic on the 29th of January, it encountered a severe winter storm which drove the ship away from the coastline. And weather records from the eastern seaboard suggest it was one of the worst storms in the first half of the 19th century. With sails and rigging heavily damaged and getting low on provisions, the ship entered Bermuda in distress after a long 21 days at sea. By the afternoon on Wednesday, February 11th, the vessel lay at anchor 300 yards from shore at Barrs Bay, 2 days before the full moon. As the crew attended to repairs, Bermudians soon became aware of the captives on board the vessel. Opposition to their enslavement coalesced around a new Black Bermudian fraternal organization called the Friendly Institution, which had just been formed in 1832. The Friendly Institution's president, a man named Richard Tucker, petitioned the Chief Justice Thomas Butterfield for a writ of habeas corpus on behalf of the enslaved on board the ship. A writ of habeas corpus meaning present the body, in essence, present the body before the court to determine if that person is being detained or imprisoned unlawfully. Brought before the Chief Justice on the evening of the 18th and before a packed audience in the Sessions House, those 78 people were called forward and individually informed they might be, quote, free as any white person, end quote, while also encouraged twice to be industrious and honest, and warned also twice that freedom meant being subject to the laws of the colony. 72 of those 78 individuals chose to remain in Bermuda, the exception being one woman, 25-year-old Matilda Ridgely, choosing, or perhaps compelled, or bribed, to carry on to Charleston with her 5 children. The Royal Gazette on the 24th of February memorably described the celebratory scene that night. Those who had been slave owners the year before now spoke against slavery with, quote, utter detestation. Oh, that other nations would follow the glorious example of the British people in doing away with the odious system of slavery, end quote. Leaving aside that the Emancipation Act did not even apply to the whole British Empire, that Royal Gazette scene described a white community that chose to see the dignified and expansive behavior of the Black community as a vindication of the post-slavery racial order being enforced in law and labor. Okay, so that's that outline of the predominant public narrative of the enterprise. Is such as that. What features stand out to you then? I think there's a few. One, the implication of an inevitable and complete progression from slavery to freedom on British soil. Here are narratives in which Bermuda was simply and inevitably the site of transformation into an uncomplicated freedom, rather than a long and incomplete emancipation. A second feature, I think, is the role of the ship and how that ship plays into the story as an inhuman agent, a ghostly stand-in for specific people making specific choices to engage in the slave trade. Third, the relative voicelessness of the enslaved themselves on the ship stands out in these narratives. People subject to history, but not really actors in history. Fourth, the enslaved mother who returned to the vessel, Matilda Ridgely, who seems caught between two worlds, always in narrative motion, either as a loyal slave or as a fearful and tragic victim, while her own intentions remain unasked and now unknown. All 4 of those features, and there are perhaps others we can talk about later, are profoundly shaped by a surviving historical archive that privileged elite and white perspectives. There are some minor discrepancies in the way the Enterprise story is told. Some of them are not very material, whether it's a brig or a brigantine, for instance, but sometimes the differences in detail are much more significant. For example, the online Wikipedia entry for the Enterprise as it exists now, since it changes from time to time, but as it currently appears, has numerous problems. The entry states that armed soldiers intervened, that a Royal Navy gunboat was called on, and so on. But there appears to be no evidence for any of that in the contemporary documents. The entry also claims that Richard Tucker presented the writ of habeas corpus to the captain himself, but the records clearly indicate it was the constable who did this. So this is an entry which exaggerates conflict and dramatic moments, but is not itself substantiated. Remarkably, almost at the same moment, both Governor Chapman and the American consular agent in Bermuda, William Tudor Tucker, wrote their own reports on what had happened. Chapman to the Colonial Office in London, Tucker to the American Secretary of State, John Forsyth. This was on days either side of the Enterprise's departure for Charleston on the 1st of March. So we have a chance to see 2 quite different narratives of these events being constructed almost in real time, as it were, which is a pretty unusual opportunity. First, the governor's report. The governor's report encapsulates most of what became the predominant narrative of the Enterprise incident in Bermuda, emphasizing a dispassionate judicial process that, in his words, quote, allowed their freedom to the enslaved, end quote. Chapman argued that the danger of the ship leaving unexpectedly brought matters to a head, despite the lack of clarity in the existing laws, and persuaded by the general public's feeling that the detainment of the slaves on board had become a matter of universal notoriety in Bermuda. Chapman was trying to moderate what is actually a quite conflicted series of exchanges within the Bermuda government, too complex to deal with here, except just briefly. The internal report, for instance, of the Attorney General, John Harvey Darrell, discouraged direct contact with the enslaved passengers, warning it risked antagonizing the United States by interference. But he was also concerned that their presence in Bermuda would be a grievous burden to a place with a, quote, already redundant population, end quote, of black labor. Pretty revealing words in the racialized labor tensions of 1834 and 1835. The Solicitor General, Duncan Stewart, agreed that if the government approached the enslaved, that would place them in the status of fugitives, which colonial governments had just been ordered to actively exclude from the colonies. Stewart similarly worried about the pressure of new arrivals, quote, upon a community already burdened by its colored population, end quote, wording that implicitly placed Black Bermudians outside of mainstream Bermudian society. So Chapman drew attention instead to the initiative of the Friendly Institution in petitioning for a writ of habeas corpus from the Chief Justice. And once the judicial process was over, by organizing a voluntary subscription to meet the immediate needs of the newly freed. But even here, there was considerable caution rooted in the discomforts of emancipation. Chapman ended his report by saying of the formerly enslaved, who after all had only been on shore for 10 days at that point, that not a single complaint of vagrancy or crime had been made against them. And that, quote, the apprehensions which were so naturally entertained of their becoming troublesome to the community as yet have not been realized. But what about the American consular agent's report? Tucker wrote a brief and emotionless report which really distanced himself from the proceedings in Hamilton. You'll notice the passive tone in which that short section is written there. He cast Bermudian officials as both dictatorial and arbitrary. He emphasized the vessel's distressed state. Tucker reported that Customs House officers immediately, quote, seized her on account of there being slaves on board, end quote, holding the ship's papers to prevent departure. The same officials, he claimed, quote, after a day or two acknowledged they had done wrong, end quote, and promised to return the papers once repairs were completed. When the vessel was ready to depart on the 18th, however, the captain was told that the papers would be held, quote, until the pleasure of the governor was known respecting the slaves, end quote. By this framing, Tucker focused attention on arbitrary government action against American property and American sovereignty. Strikingly, Tucker's report to Washington does not mention the intercession of Black Bermudians at all, either in initiating the writ of habeas corpus or in their actions to welcome and house the new arrivals, both of which had already been locally reported in the Royal Gazette on the 24th of February, a week before he wrote his report. Instead, Tucker places the origins of the writ of habeas corpus solely in the Chief Justice's hands, and by condensing what ensued before the judge to, quote, the slaves were then proclaimed free, end quote, he also silenced the active choice the formerly enslaved were offered and the decisions they made. So what do we know about the ship itself in this fateful voyage? Historian Jeffrey Kerr Ritchie tried to identify the ship Enterprise unsuccessfully 3 times, but he seems to be the only one who's actually tried. An answer to the question was provided by the port entry book for Hamilton. And from this source, we can identify that the brig was built in Maine in 1823 and registered in New York just previously in 1834. That means that in 1835, the ship was nearing the last phase of its working life, giving further poignancy to the terrors of the ship's victims as the crew battled the Atlantic storm. The port book identifies the ship owner too, a minor New York City merchant named Edwin Adams, about whom I can find as yet no other significant reference to. It is a reminder, I think, the port book here, of how pervasive and opportunistic the American internal slave trade was. No small ship owner or captain in the coastal trade could afford to turn down a human cargo. It was so prevalent and so integral to commerce on the American seaboard. The captain in this case was Elliot Smith, a man whose judgments and expertise were later found by his peers to be questionable. I could find no other substantial references to Elliot Smith either. The internal slave trade, of which the enterprise was part, transported nearly 1 million people from the upper South to the expanding lower South from 1807 to 1861, peaking in the 1830s when the enterprise sailed. The American consular agent in Bermuda is the only source that notes that 2 of the crew on the enterprise were not in fact American citizens, which is interesting because it defied American claims that the nation's slave economy was wholly and cogently bounded by the American nation. A sign of the unusual circumstances and hesitancy on its arrival in Bermuda, I think, is that unusually in the official records of the Customs House of Hamilton, the enterprise was both entered inwards and cleared outwards on the same day, February 26, collapsing the 15 days the vessel lay at anchor in Barrs Bay, although the vessel, in fact, didn't actually sail until the 1st of March when the winds were favorable. Oddly, the 4 human traffickers involved in the voyage of the enterprise have only been partially identified before in the existing literature. The port books for Alexandria, Virginia, the main port of Washington, D.C., make it clear how closely the enterprise was intertwined with some of the most substantial participants in the internal slave trade in the United States. The human trafficker listed as the shipper of 73 individuals on the enterprise was Joseph D. Neal of Washington, D.C., who had taken over the slave pens just previously of the equally infamous W. Roby. Neal now ran one of the 2 slave trading establishments so large in scale they were illustrated in the American Anti-Slavery Society's 1836 broadside, Slave Market of America, which also reproduced one of his notices advertising his eagerness to purchase young people. A further 5 individuals, a partial or intact family unit, were consigned by Thomas N. Davis of Loudoun County, Virginia, just northwest of Washington. Davis had by then transitioned from tobacco planter to slave trader, locating his business in Washington and promising, quote, higher prices in cash for likely young slaves, end quote, than his competitors. By the mid-1830s, Davis was operating from the same locale in Washington where other slave traders were clustered, and he was directly across the street from the Gadsby Hotel where in 1841 Solomon Northup was kidnapped. Attracted to illegality by his greed for bondspeople, especially children, Davis was arrested and charged in 1847 with kidnapping 2 free boys in Washington and attempting to sell them into slavery in Memphis. Unsuccessful, thankfully. So the strikingly young age profile of the enterprise's enslaved cargo was not an unfortunate incidental, but the consequence of a deliberate market strategy evolving between procurers and planters during the agricultural boom in the Deep South. Their slave merchant associates in Charleston were themselves typical of the close integration of the internal slave trade with other commercial and credit activities between American ports. The larger group of 73 bondspeople were consigned to Oliver Simpson, slave merchant of Charleston and of Hamburg, a cotton emporium on the Savannah River. Like Davis, Simpson advertised particularly his sales of, quote, likely young, end quote, enslaved persons, and he was also an active participant in establishing and overseeing banking activities in both cities. The smaller family group transported by Davis were consigned to Thomas N. Gadsden of Charleston, then on his way to becoming the principal slave auctioneer of Charleston, and believed by some to be the respected patriarch of one of the first families in the state. Gadsden was certainly notorious enough to be the particular subject of historian Frederick Bancroft's 1931 critical expose, Slave Trading in the Old South, who targeted Gadsden in particular in his chapter on Charleston. I think it is important to be clear here, though. Identifying the 4 slave traders involved as leading actors in human trafficking isn't intended to make the enterprise incident seem more important by association with these infamous men. Instead, I think the point to make is that the enterprise voyage was not at all an aberration. Certainly unusual in the Bermuda dimension, of course, but the voyage itself was absolutely part of the main trajectory of the voracious, predatory, and profitable appetite for slaves, especially children, which fed the internal trade out of Washington through to Alexandria. Before the vessel sailed from Alexandria on the 22nd of January, 1835, Captain Elliott Smith, alongside those 2 first slave traders, signed sworn affidavits before George Brent, the collector for the Customs House in Alexandria, District of Columbia. Together, these men declared that the cargo of 41 adults and 37 children aboard the ship were in fact legally bound in service or labor in the United States, and that none among them were, quote, entitled to freedom, end quote. In filling out these manifests and confirming the legal status of human property, federal officers benefited enslavers. I think we've underestimated the extent to which the US federal government was an active participant in the slave trade and the political economy of slavery. And so the Enterprise left the port of Alexandria authorized and protected under the laws of the United States, carrying on board 78 enslaved persons, a master and a crew of 6, 3 passengers, and a heavy cargo of bricks, tobacco, and seeds bound for Charleston, South Carolina. These officiating documents, the sworn affidavits and ship's manifests, mark the first appearance in the Enterprise archive of the captives who would soon find themselves in legal limbo below the decks of that ship when it came to rest anchored in Bermuda. Their voices and voices from the shoreline are partly submerged in the archive of the Enterprise, and when they do break the surface, they are too often filtered through the words of white colonial authorities or the white newspaper. But what if we shift a bit to think about the voyage of the Enterprise from the perspective of the enslaved rather than from the perspective of the slave traders and the captain? Is there an alternative history from below? The idea of history from below grows from the conviction that everyone, everything has its history. There are no silent people in the past. There are silenced people. People, though, who we can very often still see, even in an archive structured to erase them. Local memory, as well, often preserves those for whom there's almost no archival trace. We know nothing with certainty of what those people thought or felt in the days the Enterprise struggled at sea, all made worse by the creaks and groans of an aging ship as water washed across the decks and the rigging and sails began to fall into the sea. We don't know who they remembered or of how they prayed for their own lives, as on 2 separate occasions the crew began to heave bricks and tobacco overboard, in the words of the captain, in order to preserve the lives of those on board. End quote. All of the captives must have been ordered below decks, or perhaps the crew may have commanded the help of a strong few in the growing emergency, as was commonly done at sea. We don't know how they might have interpreted a shouted exchange at sea with a passing vessel bound for Baltimore, which Captain Smith notes in the log on February 7th. We can only speculate as to the relief, confusion, and apprehension they may have felt upon landing in port in Hamilton after 21 days, and we cannot say for sure what they knew of the legal debate surrounding their indeterminate freedom in the days following their arrival. Until a full oral history of the Enterprise survivors and their descendants is complete, we don't yet have any evidence of the voyage of the Enterprise from their perspective. But we do have contemporary descriptions that help us begin to contextualize their experience and the significance of the choice that lay ahead in Hamilton. For example, Solomon Northup, who was kidnapped in 1841, describes his own voyage from Alexandria to New Orleans and a terrible storm at sea. Here, looking backwards, after he had returned to liberty, Northup saw the utter destruction of the ship as the only escape from his own commodification. So terrible was American slavery. Perhaps another way, though, to try to understand the experience of those on board is to look at what we know about who they were. Nellie Mewson included a list of the enslaved aboard the Enterprise, dignifying and humanizing them as individuals, and countering the profound erasure and commodification of individuals that can often be the case with the records of the slave trade. Mewson reordered some of the names, however, creating presumed family groups, and did not reproduce 6 additional columns that are present in the original shipping manifest from the port of Alexandria: height, complexion, the shipper in Alexandria, the consignor in Charleston, and their places of residence. There is also, I should note, a small error in Mewson's list. Philip Rideout is clearly 35 in the original, not 25 as Mewson has it in Mind the Onion Seed, so you can update your copies with confidence, I think. Now, 78, the number 78 of persons on the Enterprise is below the average on the coastwise slave trade in the 1830s, which was around 100 to 110 people. But the Enterprise was not a large vessel at 127 tons. Sorry. Otherwise, the group of enslaved reflect many of the characteristics of the coastwise slave trade in comparison with overland routes such as down the Mississippi. Notably, a young age profile and a majority of consigned commercial individuals rather than persons accompanying migrating planters moving south. What is so striking about the Enterprise manifests is that of those 78 individuals, only 3 were over the age of 25, with the eldest individual just 35. None of the adults over 16 years old was over 5'8.5" tall, and most were substantially shorter, perhaps a result of youth or malnutrition. From the slave trafficker's perspective, the desirable age range on the slave market was 15 to 29, and the Enterprise carried 24 people in that age range, a majority of them women. The single largest group of captives, though, was the 31 children under the age of 10. The shipping manifests include just 3 direct familial references linking mothers and infants, but surnames and age profiles suggest at least 8 partial family groups: 6 mothers with children, 1 pair of sisters, and a brother and a sister. With more than 50 bondspeople under the age of 16 and so few families, there were as many as 33 children on the Enterprise without any parent or sibling to comfort them. What the manifests reveal then is that these are the particular victims of the violent repackaging of enslaved families for sale and the production of the fictive orphans who satisfied paternalist fantasies among the purchasers of people. The violence of this human trafficking was papered over in the shipping manifests by the very common-looking Anglo-American names displayed in the orderly lists. Nonetheless, there are clues to that violence in these ledgers. 3 adult men appear without surnames, for instance. 5 unaccompanied children bear the surname of a Maryland plantation from which they were kidnapped, while the identifier column of complexion served to mark the legal distance between slaveholders and the enslaved. But a different list of names, recorded in the Court of Assizes on the 18th of February 1835, suggests another way to see a history from below for the Enterprise. And this document is one that I've not seen referred to before, but it is a striking one. This document lists the names of those individuals in the order they were called before the Chief Justice. First adult men, then adult women, then mothers with children, and then those young children there without family, whose friends nonetheless spoke for them. We can get a sense from this, I think, of how individuals and families supported each other in the face of what must have been a momentous decision, taken in the face of great uncertainty. People who made freedom claims as individuals, as kinfolk, as a community. By doing so, they reconstituted those bodies which had been disassembled by the cruel, dehumanizing calculation of the shipping manifests. One of the curious questions about the Enterprise episode is how exactly did the general public in Bermuda come to know about the nature of the cargo on the Enterprise? Most narratives seem to assume that news came from the customs house, that is, from white witnesses. Nellie Mewson says the collector of customs, a man named George Salton, boarded the ship and noticed and communicated to government. There is indeed a letter from the customs house to Governor Chapman on the next day, the 12th of February, seeking instructions as to what to do. Attorney General Darrell said that the enslaved on board had been, quote, debarred from communication with shore, end quote. So it wasn't from them directly. I think there's a better possibility, though. In order to protect himself from liability for damages to the ship and cargo, the Captain Elliot Smith registered a standard notarized statement called a protest on the 18th of February, describing the perilous voyage and specific damages to the ship. In that protest, he notes that at 11 a.m. on the 11th of February, the Enterprise was boarded by a pilot who guided the vessel to its anchorage over the next 4 hours. Piloting in Bermuda was a competitive and specialized trade whose members ventured far offshore to secure the fee that came from being the first hailed by an arriving vessel. Significantly, the great majority of pilots were Black Bermudians, including enslaved men prior to 1834. These men were celebrated all around the Atlantic maritime world for their skills and confidence. Since it was a profitable and independent employment, Bermuda's Black pilots repeatedly fended off white efforts to regulate and intrude on their craft, including in 1835, doing so in part through collective petitioning alongside other members of other Black trades. So I think it's highly likely that the news first spread informally from that Bermudian pilot, who would have been the first to board the vessel and was most likely a Black man. For the general public, a brief note in the Royal Gazette published the following Monday on the 17th of February made the arrival of the slave ship in Bermuda public knowledge 6 days after its evening arrival. The note also signaled the unusual difficulty presented by its problematic cargo. An attentive reader would notice in the newspaper that the Enterprise, despite the notice here indicating its arrival, the Enterprise was not listed among the vessels that were either entered or reported inwards at the Customs House in Hamilton the prior week. Nor were its 3 passengers ever named among the arrivals or those in onward transit, which was commonly done in the Royal Gazette. One entry in the Charleston newspaper when the Enterprise arrived there later in March indicates that one of those passengers was W.R. Neal, almost certainly the son of the slave trader Joseph Neal, sent to accompany his investment south. Though it's impossible to prove if it was a Black pilot who first realized who was on the ship, one channel for how information about the Enterprise spread within the Black community in Hamilton is also suggested by how the friendly institution in Pembroke Parish mobilized. The Chief Justice alone specifically identified the leading advocate from this group as Richard Tucker, hotel keeper, merchant, and long-serving president of the Young Men's Friendly Institution. I think it was through Tucker that the pilot's knowledge about the cargo was mobilized. Why, though? Who was Richard Tucker? In the year of the Enterprise incident, the Pembroke Parish Assessment listed Richard Tucker among 11 Black property owners among the 252 individual households taxed that year. Tucker was eighth amongst those 11 men, though he was well below the overall parish average in terms of holdings. Taken together, these 11 men encompass the opportunities and limitations faced by Black Bermudians in the period of emancipation, characterized by mixed strategies of small storekeeping, skilled trades like carpentry, and inshore maritime activities. But their low to modest assessed property ownership suggests the profound challenges they faced in competing with the dominant society in the emancipation period and the value of collective support, such as through the fraternal societies. The 1835 parish assessment links Richard Tucker with a house and lot in Hamilton owned by white Bermudian James Mewson. This was presumably the hotel managed by Tucker, which provided services to passengers from Mewson's vessels engaged in trade between Bermuda and maritime Canada, London, and the Caribbean. So here then at Mewson's Hotel, we have a literate man, Richard Tucker, located at a center of a web of Atlantic mobility, knowledge, and communication while leading a Black fraternal society, all in a public setting where he became both familiar with and familiar to white society. More immediately, Tucker's urgent necessity in securing the freedom of the Enterprise cargo must be understood in the context of his own experience, having as a free man married an enslaved woman named Charlotte Bell 4 years before Emancipation Day. It is abundantly clear that the writ issued by the Chief Justice on Richard Tucker's demand cut through the indecision of the executive branch in Bermuda, and by removing the enslaved from the ship, created the conditions for their choosing freedom. Since it recenters the initiative of the Black community over the executive branch, the case of the Enterprise, I think, demonstrates the extent of Black Bermudian knowledge of the law and their capacity to use the law to both advance and protect their interests and rights. That point was made by Dr. Robinson in 1979, but has been quite diluted since. I think it's why the work of Dr. Michael Bradshaw on the Friendly Societies is so important. We need to know about more about how did people talk to each other about resilience and resistance. So to conclude, Richard Tucker and the Friendly Institution's decisive action with the writ of habeas corpus and organizing subsequent aid to the freedom seekers within homes is the central lesson of the Enterprise incident. Mobilizing knowledge of the law certainly, but not just of the law, as well as forming social solidarities and political movements at the scale of everyday life. All that would be seen again, for instance, in the resistant collective that opposed the government's immigration proposals in 1855. Another element of the Enterprise that I think needs recovered is how it was part of a common wind of maritime resistance to slavery and the slave trade all around the Atlantic. What can seem like a local event has significance in the larger narrative of Atlantic freedom. Jeffrey Kerr Ritchie calls what happened on the Enterprise an important maritime insurrection. Those who made a dramatic choice to walk ashore in the face of bribes and coercion were freedom seekers. Some of the broad links to the Enterprise in the Atlantic world are surprising. In 1838, the insurers of the Enterprise tried to avoid paying out to the slave trader Oliver Simpson in a South Carolina court, and the insurance company's lawyer was Henry Grimke, none other than the brother of the famed sisters Angelina and Sarah Grimke, two of the most famous American abolitionists and public anti-slavery speakers. Just after the Enterprise passengers made their choice in Bermuda, and as he waited on his insurance claim, the slave trader Joseph Neal was asked why he didn't just go to Bermuda and repossess his human property. Here, his all-caps frustration suggests just how much the Enterprise incident turned on its head American slaveholding society's ideas of racial power and the fiction of paternalism that lay behind the trafficking of enslaved children. Finally, there are other ways to see hope as well, I think, in the resistant communication between freedom seekers around the Atlantic about liberty. Historian Kerr Ritchie notes something said by a fugitive slave, William Gross, who was forcibly separated from his free wife in Virginia and trafficked from Baltimore to New Orleans before escaping. William Gross later on said of his voyage, quote, "Nothing special occurred except on one occasion when after some thick weather the ship came near an English island. The captain then hurried us all below and closed the hatches. After passing the island, we had liberty to come up again." End quote. If that island was Bermuda, Here is a powerful image of disruption, a challenge to slaveholders' mastery that had to be removed from vision and temptation, but also a sliver of hope on the horizon, a potential future just glimpsed in passing, but remembered years later by William Gross. An island emancipation just on the horizon, however much that emancipation remained contested within Bermuda itself. Thank you very much for your time.
Wow, Neal, that's a lot to take in, and that was excellent. Thank you so much. Not just because of the depth of your content and the sharing of all that new research, but how you explore the understanding the past is shaped by the surviving documents and archival records. So I'm sure many of you have questions, and we do have time, 15 minutes for a few questions. So please put your questions into the chat, and we'll select a few for Dr. Kennedy to answer. So, but I'll just take a moment. There's a lot to process in your lecture. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Elena. That's very kind of you to say, and I was remiss at the beginning to thank the museum for what now has been years of really strong support for my career, and I'm humbled and extremely grateful for the long-term support.
Oh, we're pleased to have the long-standing relationship. I think you first came to Bermuda as a student of William and Mary and doing some archaeological field work at Hog Bay. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes, Hog Bay, and then Castle Island a couple of years after that.
Yeah. Okay, I have one. Do we have any details on how the Black Bermudan community supported the actions of Richard Tucker and the Friendly Society?
That's a great question. Thank you, Kieran. We don't have specific details. The best bit of evidence comes from that Royal Gazette story on the 24th of February, which describes the scene. And I think we do need to watch a little bit how we use that story, because quite clearly that story is intended to present a particular image of what has happened. But it does contain details such as a subscription that's raised of $70 from the people that are there, who are both white and black Bermudians, and also describes that a situation in which the 72 who have chosen to remain in Bermuda need to be accommodated. It's now nearly midnight by the time the list of names has been gone through by the Chief Justice, and people have made their fateful decisions. And so one thing the Friendly Institution does, quite clearly from that description, is coordinate the offers of support from Bermudians. Who exactly they are isn't made clear, and I don't think the records sufficiently detailed for us to know. But it seems to be both in the short term, housing people that evening, providing some material support immediately for provisions and so on. And in the longer term, in terms of housing, the governor does say in his report to London that quite soon after, and he's writing 10 days after the incident in the courthouse, he says the freedom seekers from the Enterprise now in Bermuda have been distributed across the island and are being housed in people's homes. So we have a few hints of what happened. The exact details, I think, remain, and perhaps the oral history, which I hope will be collected in the future, might provide some details on that case. So I don't know if that is sufficient as an answer, but the details are not really there in the archive, but there's certainly an indication of widespread support and the Friendly Institution playing a vital role in coordinating that support and encouraging that support.
Okay, we have some questions that we have a few questions similar topic. So relating to Matilda Ridgely. So there's a few questions about Kristen White is saying that she's been so drawn to that story with no record of her since leaving Bermuda. What do you believe happened to her? And this can probably also fall in to what happened to her, and then why did she decide to not remain? So
right.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you, Kristen. Good to have you here again. I don't know. I had a look, and my feeling is that she is is trafficked out of Charleston very quickly. And there is a court case indicating that I think it's 1841. There's a somewhat spurious insurance claim made by Oliver Simpson, and the court throws it out in South Carolina because it's pretty dubious. And I think it's described in the newspaper, and I think it's the source for the Wikipedia entry talking about gunboats and troops and so on, because it makes these outrageous claims about American property being seized in Bermuda. But in passing, the reference suggests that indeed a number of people that he's making his insurance claim on have already been sold and have already left Charleston. And so there's some question about his actual his right to file for insurance for them. So my suspicion is the names are changed. The surnames probably are changed pretty quickly, which was very common. It happens to Solomon Northup, whose name is changed something like 5 or 6 times. And that may well have been what happened. So unfortunately, I don't know the answer to. I had hoped to get to South Carolina and do some research, but of course, the last 2 years have made all of that pretty well impossible. The next question, though, I think, yeah, this is a really interesting matter. This question of why she may have chosen. The truth is, we don't know. Where there are hints that perhaps she was going onwards to a family member, a husband, perhaps, or some other kinfolk who were in Charleston already. That seems likely. It may well have been fear of the unknown, fear, uncertainty about Bermuda. She may have been coerced. There's evidence in the Royal Gazette story that Elliot Smith, or perhaps the W.R. Neal, who was on board as a passenger, that perhaps they were trying to bribe individuals to not go on shore against the habeas corpus. So some of that may be happening. I think she's really, really interesting. I've been thinking about Matilda Ridgely quite a bit. She's really a cipher in these stories, right? She's a stand-in for whatever we want her to be, whatever different narratives want her to be, because she is ultimately unknowable. We don't know her decision making. Southern American newspapers refer to her in really approving terms, of course, as you might suspect, for loyally, quote, expressing a determination to remain on board, end quote. And so what they often do is they'll name her specifically in contrast to the 72 who stay in Bermuda, who are not named and are simply referred to as property, as American property, property of American citizens, and so on. And so she's used there as a foil, I think. And so she's interpreted as a kind of as evidence of loyalty, and becomes an emblem for the paternalism of slavery in the American South. She's the proof of the goodness and the paternalism as they understood it in slaveholding society, and so she's interesting that way. She's a cipher. I think one of the concerns we have with Matilda is a concern that has been quite often the case in the study of slavery in the last 30 years or so, but although things have shifted in the last 10 years, I'd say, which is that historians have tended to look backwards from a modern lens of individual freedom, what historians call agency. And that tends to diminish that people had other priorities in the past: kinship, community, familiarity, all those things on which people made decisions. And so one of the ways that the question becomes we get a little bit trapped in the question of why didn't she choose freedom in Bermuda? The question itself, I think, forecloses other possibilities, other kinds of decisions or factors that led to her decision. I think what's important too about Matilda Ridgely, though, is whatever might have happened to her later on, and maybe we will discover it, is that she is there indelibly in the archive. She's an important reminder of why we do research and why we remember. She is a reminder, I think, that the past is not to be disregarded. That's a good question there too. So is there any evidence that some of the people were free and were being kidnapped and sold into slavery? The evidence we have is largely from oral history, and Nellie Mewson talks about this, that there are 5 individuals, 5 children, who are reportedly kidnapped from the Warfield plantation in Maryland, and that they had an indigenous mother. There's no evidence in the documents. The documents are simply have this kind of cold calculation, these cold ledgers of names. But the oral history on that seems pretty solid. And I haven't been able to find any documents yet for that particular plantation that would allow any of that kind of fine grain analysis. But there is a really interesting database of freedom suits in Maryland. And I was looking through that the other day, and there are a substantial number in there of enslaved individuals seeking manumission or seeking redress for particular treatment and so on, or trying to sue for the freedom of a family member. And there's a notable number in there which lay claim to Indigenous identity. So the potential that the Warfield children, on the one hand, on the one hand have Indigenous ancestry, and secondly, that they were in fact kidnapped and sold into slavery is pretty good. Generally, I would say, given the kinds of people that we're talking about in Washington, the kinds of slave traders like Joseph Neal, it is almost certainly that some of those individuals had been free and were being had been kidnapped and were being sold into slavery. People like Solomon Northup, William Gross, other people like that. The evidence is abundant. The percentages are unclear because, of course, it's not something recorded in the ledgers of the slave traders. But from the large collection of narratives from those who are able to escape slavery, it's pretty clear that there's a quite substantial number who are being kidnapped, and that is in part why I use the language of human trafficking, because they are trafficking in people who are not legally enslaved, and so that manifest in Alexandria, which authorizes and provides this confirming language that none have the right to claim freedom, is significant, because it is the kind of alchemy that transforms those people into enslaved property against their will.
We have time for one more question, Neal. So
Sure.
Is there one that is particularly standing out for you in the chat?
Just let me get them here.
And there's a few comments about, have you done research about the descendants?
Yeah, that's a great question. It'd be a great project. Sarah Hannon, my colleague who's a PhD student, she's just forming her proposal for her dissertation, and I don't want to speak for her, but I suspect her dissertation will engage in quite a bit of that work. The file on the Enterprise of the Bermuda Archive has some of that work done already. There are people who have collected some of that oral history, but I think there's much more to be done. There are a large number of individuals who claim ancestry from the Enterprise descendants.
We might have some in the room tonight.
Yes, I absolutely wouldn't be surprised. And while the poster for this talk has that striking picture of Mary Warfield, who was one of those children kidnapped from Warfield Plantation.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up. So I'm just mindful of time. So again, thank you so much. And thank you to the National Museum team who are working behind the scenes. And thank you to all of you who joined us tonight. Next week, we will send the lecture recording and a short survey so we can continue to improve on our work. Also, if you want to deep dive into the lecture topic, don't forget there's the syllabus, which has further readings, things to watch, and then some reflective questions. And I also hope, if you can send to the next slide, Deb, that I hope you will join us in our next lecture by Dr. Michael Bradshaw, who will discuss the pivotal role of Bermuda-friendly societies. So a really great next lecture after yours. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Neal, and have a good evening.
Great. Thank you, Elena. And please do, if anyone has further questions we didn't get to, please just email me. I'm happy to continue the conversation